In June 1944, a massive fleet of warships and landing craft gathers for another D-Day. Thousands of American soldiers are preparing to assault a well-defended enemy behind strong fortifications. But this isn't Normandy. It's the Pacific island of Saipan, and the brutal battle here will push total war deep into Japan's sphere. By late 1943, Japan is losing ground across the Pacific. That September, its leaders order a withdrawal to a new national defense zone intended to secure key territories, rebuild military strength, and safeguard vital supply lines to Japan's home islands. Their new operational policy demands that every outpost be held to the last man. In the U.S. command, General Douglas MacArthur, head of the Southwest Pacific area, argues for liberating the Philippines before striking Japan. But Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, envisions another path, leapfrogging across Japanese-held islands that could serve as bases for B-29 bombers on the direct route to the home islands. Ultimately, Washington approves both approaches. Admiral Chester Nimitz will lead the Central Pacific offensive. Nimitz's Fifth Fleet prepares to target the Japanese strongholds scattered across the Marianas. Carolines and Palau. Though many garrisons will be bypassed, several islands must be taken for their airfield potential. As Rear Admiral Harry W. Hill later explained, the islands suitable for air bases could almost be counted on two hands. Naturally, the Japanese had already fortified them, and there were no more. When we needed an airfield, we had no choice but to take one away from them. It was that simple. The Mariana Islands, stretching some 750 kilometers across the Central Pacific, sit at the heart of Japan's defensive perimeter. Guam, Saipan, and Tinian host key air bases. Saipan and Tinian, Japanese colonies before the war, were developed for sugarcane production, though heavy Japanese settlement turned the native Chamorro population into a minority. Guam, once American, had been seized by Japan in 1941. Fifth Fleet Commander Admiral Raymond Spruance intends to capture Saipan and Tinian first, build U.S. air bases there, and then retake Guam. The Assault Force, V Amphibious Corps, made up of the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, supported by the 27th Infantry Division and 5th Corps Artillery, will strike Saipan. 4 beaches on the southwest coast are chosen, codenamed Red, Green, Blue, and Yellow. But a jutting promontory, Afetna Point, will divide the 2 Marine divisions, and coral reefs will complicate the landings. To overcome the reefs, planners prioritize LVTs, landing vehicles, tracked, capable of crawling over obstacles and onto the shore. In a rare decision, Marines are ordered to ride their LVTs inland rather than dismount at the beaches. The 4th Marine Division accepts this plan, but the 2nd Division objects. They remember the LVT's failures in the rough terrain of Guadalcanal and distrust the Army crews operating them. General Holland "Howlin' Mad" Smith, commanding the Corps, expects his Marines to reach Objective 1 1.3 kilometers inland by the end of D-Day. He anticipates a quick victory in the south before driving north. Roughly 95,000 U.S. troops stand ready to seize and occupy Saipan. On the Japanese side, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the man who once led the attacks on Pearl Harbor and Midway, but later fell from favor, is tasked with defending the Marianas. On Saipan, General Yoshitsugu Saito commands around 32,000 troops from the 43rd Division and 41st Independent Mixed Brigade, plus small naval and air detachments. Yet their defenses are incomplete. The island's interior high ground offers good artillery positions, but a lack of transport, supplies, and coordination cripples the defenders. Reinforcements sent in May suffer further losses when U.S. submarines sink several transport ships, straining already tense relations between the Army and Navy. Even so, Saito organizes Saipan into 4 defensive zones and positions artillery on elevated terrain overlooking the beaches. Expecting a U.S. landing in the southwest, he readies the 9th Tank Regiment to launch immediate counterattacks. Meanwhile, Japan's Navy prepares Operation A-Go, a decisive battle plan involving the 1st Mobile Fleet, its most modern carriers, which will steam toward the Marianas to annihilate the American invasion fleet with carrier and land-based air power. Admiral Spruance fears such an assault and orders Task Force 58, his powerful carrier group, to remain on the defensive, a cautious approach that frustrates its aggressive commander, Admiral Mark Mitcher. Preparations for D-Day, just a week after the Allies storm Normandy. U.S. forces in the Pacific prepare for their own D-Day. In sheer firepower, the fleet off Saipan surpasses even Operation Overlord. Beginning 3 days before the invasion, American warships and carrier aircraft pound Japanese airfields and fortifications across Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. They even fire white phosphorus into Saipan's sugarcane fields to burn them clear. But the attempt fails. Japanese civilian Shizuko. Miura recalls watching the bombardment. "I looked up for the enemy planes. It was a vast formation, hundreds, perhaps thousands. Until the war came to Saipan, I had never seen a dead man's face. But there before me lay 2 soldiers, as if to show me, look, this is death itself." American shells flatten the towns of Garapan and Charankanoa, destroy coastal guns, and sever communications among Japanese units. Yet overall, the bombardment disappoints. Battleships trained for sea targets struggle to hit well-hidden bunkers and caves. Meanwhile, underwater demolition teams survey the beaches, clearing obstacles and marking safe channels for the ships that will bring in tanks. Before the main landings on June 15th, Marines conduct diversionary feints in the north. But the Japanese aren't fooled. D-Day on Saipan at 8:40 a.m. The first assault wave surges toward the beaches. Amphibious tractor battalions of the Army and Marine Corps operate roughly 700 LVTs, some configured as gunboats, rockets, command posts, or even amphibious tanks, carrying 8,000 Marines in the opening wave. Naval and air bombardments continue until the LVTs are just 100 meters from shore. Then everything unravels. As the amphibious vehicles grind over the reefs, Japanese gunners open up. Shifting tides push the 2nd Marine Division northward, causing units to land on the wrong beaches and creating confusion and traffic jams. When the LVTs jam the shoreline, pre-sighted Japanese artillery and mortars, still intact and well camouflaged, unleash devastating fire. Casualties mount rapidly, yet within 20 minutes, American troops are ashore. Progress, however, is slow. Rough, swampy terrain and disorganized landings limit their advance. Although 98% of the 4th Division's LVTs reach land, only about half make it 300 meters inland. Amphibious tanks fare little better. Heavy surf swamps some offshore, while others bog down near Charankanoa. Still, they manage to destroy 11 Japanese tanks that counterattack, though few reach their designated positions on time. Meanwhile, Marine depot companies, including many African-American Marines, land to establish supply and logistics bases. But almost immediately, they too come under intense mortar fire from the defenders entrenched in the hills above. As the Marines advance inland, bypassed Japanese defenders continue to fire from concealed positions. Some Americans push through the swampy interior, while others struggle to reconnect the 2 Marine divisions. 2 battalions of the 8th Marines fight their way across. Green to Beach to assault Afetna Point. Half of G Company is equipped with shotguns, ideal for close quarters combat and for avoiding friendly fire toward troops. Advancing from Blue Beach, Saipan would not be the last time. Marines relied on shotguns during island assaults. Marine combat. Shotguns on Saipan, Jonathan Ferguson. Hello, everyone. Jonathan here at the Royal Armories. In front of me is the Winchester Model 1912, later known in the Second World War as the Model 12 combat shotgun. The name changed, but the gun's function remained. A pump-action design operating in classic fashion, 1 round per cycle. It holds 8 shells in a tubular magazine beneath the barrel, just like the civilian version, which was produced in huge numbers. What turns this into a military weapon are the markings, the U.S. service stamp and the flaming bomb insignia of the Ordnance Department, marking it as government issue. Many were finished in the dull gray typical of wartime arms, though this one retains its blued sheen. The real star, though, is the bayonet, the same type issued for the Model 1917 Enfield rifle from World War I. The bayonet lug and heat shield are built as a single removable unit. a design borrowed from the earlier Winchester 1897, originally intended for guarding prisoners. Ironically, that earlier shotgun saw little actual combat despite German protests about its use. But its successor, the Model 12, became a true frontline weapon in the Second World War. With its bayonet attached, this shotgun becomes a formidable close-quarters tool, whether for containing prisoners or storming beaches and trenches. The bayonet adds considerable reach, and its buckshot ammunition, 8 rounds per tube, is devastating at short range. Popular culture often exaggerates its power, people being flung through walls or the spread being impossibly wide. But in reality, these weapons were far more accurate and effective at moderate distances than most realize. At close range, within roughly 20 meters, the impact was truly fight-stopping, though not a replacement for a rifle. On Saipan, about 1 in every 2 Marines carried both a rifle and one of these shotguns. Heavy and cumbersome, yes, but invaluable for trench fighting and assaults through fortifications, where a single blast could clear a bunker. Ammunition, however, posed problems. During Guadalcanal in 1942-43, the Marines discovered that the paper shotgun shells, standard for the time, swelled in the tropical humidity and jammed the magazine. Metal casings were recommended, but implementation was slow, and by Saipan, paper shells were still in use, a serious drawback in the island's heat. Despite its limitations, the Model 12 was unmatched for brutal, close-quarters fighting, clearing bunkers, trenches, and dugouts. Once outside those confined spaces, though, Marines quickly switched back to their rifles, often the bolt-action Springfield 1903 or the semi-automatic M1 Garand. The Model 12 and its successors remained in niche use long after the war, from breaching doors to close combat in conflicts like Afghanistan, proving its enduring practicality as a fighting shotgun. Even with new tactics and the fearsome firepower of these weapons, the Marines failed to seize a Fetna Point or link the divisions by nightfall. At the end of D-Day, American forces hold barely half their intended objectives and suffer around 2,000 casualties, including many officers. Some units reach the base of Mount Finasusa, but pull back to defensible positions, bracing for counterattacks through the night. As expected, Japanese troops strike back, though their assaults are uncoordinated and frantic. In one horrifying instance, they advance behind women and children used as human shields. American tanks, artillery, and naval gunfire cut down every attack, leaving the ground littered with the cost of Japan's desperate resistance. On D+1, the 27th Infantry Division lands with additional artillery support as the Marines strengthen their beachhead, make modest advances, and finally link the divided fronts. In the early hours of D+2, the Japanese launch a massive armored counterattack aimed directly at the 2nd Marine Division. Poorly coordinated and forced by terrain to advance in narrow columns, the Japanese armor penetrates parts of the American line. But U.S. Sherman tanks, half-track mounted anti-tank guns, and bazookas respond with deadly efficiency. Japanese infantry clinging to their tanks suffer catastrophic losses as U.S. fire tears through them, destroying at least 24 of 44 attacking tanks. Tank crewman Shiro Shimoda later remembered, "Most of the infantry riding our tanks were killed or left us behind." The leading elements pushed deep into the American positions and a chaotic fight erupted. Star shells lit up our tanks while gunfire and bazooka rounds destroyed them one after another. Then American M4 Shermans appeared, and we fired at them, but our shells just bounced off like baseballs. Shiro Shimoda, Rotman, Tanks, P-53. The clash becomes the largest tank battle of the Pacific War. By D+3, the 4th Marine Division succeeds in cutting Saipan in two, while the 27th Infantry Division captures Aslito Airfield, trapping the remnants of the Japanese defenders on Nafutan Point. The once formidable 43rd Division has lost half its battalions and nearly 2/3 of its artillery. Facing disaster, General Yoshitsugu Saito radios Tokyo. "Have received your honorable imperial words. By becoming the bulwark of the Pacific with 10,000 deaths, we hope to earn imperial favor." Rotman, Saipan, P-59. Battle of the Philippine Sea while brutal fighting continues on Saipan. U.S. submarines shadow the movements of Japan's first mobile fleet. Admiral Raymond, Spruance fears the Japanese might attempt to lure his covering force away and launch a night destroyer attack on the invasion fleet. In truth, however, the Japanese plan a massive aerial strike against Task Force 58's carriers themselves. On June 18th, Japanese land-based bombers attacked Task Force 58 with minimal effect. The following day, at a distance of roughly 570 kilometers, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa orders his carrier planes into action. It's too far for them to return, so they plan to refuel and land on Guam after striking, allowing Ozawa's carriers to remain safely beyond the range of American counterattacks. He dispatches about 450 carrier aircraft in successive waves, while U.S. radar picks them up and scrambles every available fighter to intercept. The Japanese flyers encounter nearly double their number of U.S. aircraft, along with an intense curtain of anti-aircraft fire. The result is what American pilots dub the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Modern and rugged American fighters like the F-6F Hellcat devastate the Japanese formations. Only a handful of enemy planes reach the fleet, and none inflict serious damage. By day's end, Japan has lost 358 carrier planes, while the U.S. loses only 33. Meanwhile, American submarines deliver further blows, sinking the Japanese carriers Taiho and Shokaku. Realizing his defeat, Ozawa orders a withdrawal on June 20th. Admiral Mark Mitcher is finally given permission to pursue, but Spruance's earlier caution has allowed the Japanese a considerable head start. Mitcher launches his aircraft from roughly 480 kilometers away, knowing they lack the fuel to make it back, unless his carriers can steam closer during the fight. In all, 216 U.S. planes strike the retreating Japanese fleet, now nearly defenseless. Grumman TBF Avengers from the carrier Belleau Wood score a fatal hit on the carrier Hyo-1 pilot, Don Lewis, later recalled the moment. The carrier below looked enormous, unreal. For a moment, I felt a strange joy. I had dreamed of this, and suddenly I was living it. Then I was horrified at myself. I must be mad. I was diving straight down, surrounded by bursts of white flak, seeing flashes of red from the guns below. Then the last shell stopped the carrier dead in my sights, and I let my bomb go. Don Lewis, Hornfisher, POW 218. Navy aircraft damage 3 additional ships, but not all pilots make it back. 80 planes either ditch into the sea or crash on their carriers due to fuel shortages. U.S. vessels managed to rescue 143 of the 177 airmen forced to ditch. The Battle of the Philippine Sea is a decisive American victory. Japan loses 3 carriers, including its largest and most modern, while the U.S. Navy suffers no ship losses. The remaining Japanese carriers are left with just 35 aircraft, rendering them effectively useless. Counting both carrier and land-based aircraft, Japan loses 476 planes and 445 pilots, losses it cannot replace. The U.S., by contrast, loses around 130 aircraft, mostly to non-combat causes. Total Japanese casualties reach around 3,000 men, compared to 109 Americans. The U.S. triumphs at sea, but Admiral Mitcher remains frustrated that Spruance's caution prevented a more complete victory. Supporters of Spruance argue, however, that given Japan's skill at stealthy night attacks, his defensive posture was justified. Back on Saipan by D+7, American forces push north toward the rugged highlands of Mount Tipo Pale, Mount Tapachau, and Hill 600. Progress is slow through broken terrain, and where vehicles can't reach, soldiers use local oxen to haul supplies. The 2nd Marine Division and 27th Infantry Division grind forward through deadly ravines and ridges nicknamed Death Valley, Hell's Pocket, and Purple Heart Ridge, while the 4th Marine Division finds more success on the eastern flank. Marine Commander Lieutenant General Holland Howlin' Mad Smith accuses the 27th Infantry Division of lacking aggressiveness and succeeds in having its commander relieved. Yet the overall pace barely changes. Some claim the 27th Division faces the toughest defenses, while others blame its slow, methodical approach as ill-suited to the terrain. Still, Japanese resistance is weakening. U.S. destroyers block reinforcements from Tinian, and Japanese units fight in isolation. Only 2,000–3,000 men remain in the north, and General Saito can communicate with just 950. With all artillery destroyed or captured, he radios Tokyo once more. Please apologize deeply to the Emperor that we cannot do better than we are. Rotman, Saipan P-65. Meanwhile, U.S. communication improves dramatically. Supporting the Marines are Native American code talkers, radio operators who use a code based on the Navajo language to transmit messages securely and rapidly. Where mechanical encryption might take 30 minutes to process 3 lines of English, code talkers could do it in 20 seconds. D+11-15 on Saipan on D+11. The 6th Marines bypass enemy strong points to seize a ridge connecting the 2 main mountains. That night, isolated Japanese troops from Nafutan Point infiltrate and strike the airfield, but are wiped out. Marines adapt quickly to the island's conditions. At night, they deploy aggressive reconnaissance units to preempt Japanese infiltrations. They flush defenders from caves using small arms, bazookas, and M3A1 Saipan flamethrower tanks. The superheated flames reached 60 to 80 yards, deep into caves and over cliff edges. When the fire didn't reach, the trapped troops often suffocated. Captain Ed Bollard and Lieutenant Brendan just shook their heads at how precious life had become so cheap in this so-called enlightened age. Saipan tank driver, Hornfisher. Padout 249 coordination among the Marines, Army, Navy, and Air Force steadily improves as each branch learns the other's strengths and limits. By D+12, building on the 4th Marine Division's momentum, the 2nd Marines and 27th Infantry Division surround Hell's Pocket, allowing gains across Death Valley and Purple Heart Ridge. By D+115, the Japanese have withdrawn to their final defensive line. As the battle enters its closing phase, both Japanese soldiers and civilians refuse surrender. Between D+116 to 19, U.S. troops advance northward, seizing Garapan and Tanapag Harbor, breaching the last Japanese positions. On D+120, the 27th Infantry Division takes over the western coastal sector. Japanese banzai charge on Saipan. The Japanese Navy promises reinforcements and urges Saito to wage guerrilla warfare. But as U.S. forces close in on his headquarters, he issues his final order. Whether we attack or stay where we are, there is only death. Yet in death there is life. We must seize this chance to display true Japanese manhood. I will advance with those who remain, deliver one last blow to the American devils, and leave my bones on Saipan as a bulwark of the Pacific. Hoffman, Paitu 222. In the early hours of July 7th, Saito commands a banzai charge against the 27th Infantry Division's 105th Regiment, around 3,000 men, many unarmed, supported by the last 3 tanks. Officially, Saito orders them to recapture Garapan and push toward Nafutan Point, but the plan is hopeless. Others recognize it as a gyokusai, a final suicide assault. Advancing in 3 columns, the Japanese overrun 2 U.S. battalions that hadn't adopted the Marines' forward scouting tactics. Forced to retreat, they try forming new perimeters, but these too collapse as the attackers surge onward, even overrunning Marine artillery and threatening the divisional headquarters at Tanapag U.S. Forces rally. Forming a defensive line and calling in a massive artillery barrage, 2,700 shells fired in a single hour. Some rounds strike isolated Americans, forcing a few to swim out to sea to be rescued by destroyers. By 8 a.m., the charge is spent and disorganized. Reinforcements arrive, and a U.S. tank platoon counterattacks, smashing what remains of the Japanese force. Despite his order, General Saito does not take part. He commits ritual suicide beforehand. In the aftermath, Americans count 4,311 Japanese bodies, though it's unclear how many were part of the attack. U.S. losses total 451 killed and 594 wounded. Some officers, like Captain Sakai Oba, condemn the futile assault and slip back into the island's central highlands to continue resistance. In the end, the banzai charge marks the collapse of organized Japanese defense on Saipan. Resistance and civilian tragedy on Saipan. Although Japanese resistance on Saipan collapses, tragedy continues. As American forces advance north, Japanese civilians and remaining troops begin committing mass suicides, using grenades, explosives, or leaping from cliffs into the sea. American soldiers attempt to stop the deaths with loudspeakers and interpreters, urging civilians to surrender safely, but their efforts achieve little. Many civilians are coerced by Japanese soldiers, who forbid surrender and insist that capture means dishonor. Years of propaganda portraying Americans as brutal torturers and murderers fuel the panic. U.S. actions such as indiscriminate fire, mutilation of bodies, and the display of remains on vehicles may also have reinforced civilian fears. The chaotic, close-quarters nature of the fighting makes surrender nearly impossible. U.S. troops often cannot distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Marine Lieutenant Lewis Myers recalled, "We knew we would find thousands of civilians beyond the beaches, but we did not count on meeting them in the midst of battle, especially the little children." Marines, many with children at home and pictures in their wallets, find it hard to fit these kids into the battle. Throwing grenades at Japs is what we were there for, but you hate to find babies in the same holes and caves from which the Japs have been firing. Astroth, P-8081, end of the Battle of Saipan on July 9th, D+24. General Holland Smith declares Saipan secured, though mopping up operations continue for months. Captain Sakai Oba and his small group of holdouts do not surrender until December 1945, after more than a year of guerrilla attacks against American troops. During the campaign, U.S. forces suffer 3,142 killed, 13,208 wounded, and 335 missing, roughly 20% of all casualties occurring in the first 48 hours. Of the 31,600 Japanese defenders, about 29,500 die, including 6,000 entombed in collapsed caves and bunkers. Only 11810 are captured, half of them Korean conscripts serving in Japanese ranks. Civilian losses are catastrophic. An estimated 22,000 killed and 14,700 interned in American camps. Battles of Tinian and Guam shortly after Saipan. American forces turned to the nearby islands of Tinian and Guam. As before, Japanese garrisons are poorly prepared but determined to fight to the death. U.S. Marines apply lessons from Saipan. Amphibious vehicles, LVTs, with front ramps, speed up beach exits, and carrier-based aircraft deploy new napalm bombs to flush out defenders. On Tinian, the Marines stage a feint toward the island's main defenses, then land further north, catching the Japanese flanks off guard. The island's flat terrain and supporting fire from Saipan and the fleet enable a rapid advance despite worsening weather during the typhoon season. On Guam, U.S. forces execute a pincer movement around the port and airfield. Fierce resistance, dense jungle, and heavy rain slow progress, but the Americans steadily push forward. As on Saipan, many Japanese soldiers hide among civilians, often forcing mass suicides, though in some instances American interpreters succeed in preventing them. By early August 1944, the U.S. secures both islands at a cost of 9,500 American, 24,000 Japanese, and 3,200 civilian casualties. Some Japanese survivors retreat into the wilderness to wage guerrilla warfare or hide for years, even decades. Epilogue: the Saipan landings, coming just a week after D-Day in Normandy, were equally decisive for the Pacific War. The U.S. had pierced Japan's outer defensive line, regained Guam, and established a clear path toward the Japanese home islands. That the United States could launch two major invasions on opposite sides of the world within weeks demonstrated its unmatched industrial and military power by 1944 historian James D. Hornfisher described Saipan and the wider Marianas Campaign as a watershed moment that brought total war to the Pacific. There was no explaining away what thousands of Marines had seen with their own disbelieving eyes in the Marianas. The ritual suicides of Japanese garrisons and their predatory brainwashing and murder of the innocent unarmed have been insufficiently considered as a turning point that shaped the war's final year. The first direct U.S. experience of total war occurred in the Marianas, and it renewed the will to win, and to win totally, using all means available without restraint. Hornfisher, a 341. As the fighting moved closer to Japan, it grew ever more extreme. Deprived of material resources and strategic options, Japanese commanders turned to ideology, invoking spiritual purity and racial superiority to justify continued resistance. The distinction between soldier and civilian blurred. One survivor, Shinozuka Yoshitaro, remembered being told by a soldier, he said, "We are no longer soldiers. You are no longer civilians. We are all just Japanese, and we all suffer the same." Astroth, P124. By late 1944, the Pacific War was far from over. U.S. planners expected an invasion of Japan itself by 1946 or 1947, yet Japan, though reeling from defeat, refused unconditional surrender, believing that one last, decisive victory might still force favorable peace terms. Both sides now turned their attention to the Philippines, the next and perhaps most symbolic step on the road to Japan.